Sigel, and welcome to Let's Talk Native. I am John Kane. I'm your show's host and producer, and I do welcome you to the show. It is March 12th, 2018, and I welcome you to Let's Talk Native on the LTN Radio Network. This program breaks all the rules for Native radio. No buffalo speeches, no mystic healing, no special Indian prayers. We tackle the real issues facing Native people with look back at our glorious and our grave history. A tough look at where we are at now, and look forward to our ongoing battles for sovereignty and autonomy. Let's Talk Native is produced in association with Iroquois Promotions on the LTN Radio Network, streaming live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation, and simulcast on the Gwe, that's CKWE in Tandaniga. You can find us at www.ltnradionet.com, and of course we are streaming live on Facebook. So I hope those of you who may be catching us online through whatever network take an opportunity to catch us on Facebook. You can find us on various Facebook group pages, not the least of which are my own, which is Let's Talk Native with John Kane and Let's Talk with John Kane on WBI in New York City. I am John Kane. I am the show's host and producer. I am solo in studio, so if I fumble around a little bit with the board, please forgive me. We're getting by with some illness that has been catching all of us, myself included. So again, forgive me for any little stumbles I may have as I try to fade our music in and out and the like. I've got an interesting show I want to talk about, and part of it is a direct response to a posting that somebody had put on one of my group pages, and it was a posting relating to the Smithsonian, the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., basically talking about the fact, and it is a fact, that that Native people in some instances were slaveholders, and they held slaves, and they had them work their plantations just like white men did. So I guess the way it was presented, and at least the headline in the article, suggested that that Native slaveholding complicates the Trail of Tears narrative, and of course they're specifically talking about some of the wealthier Cherokee who had held slaves and who had put slaves to work, owned slaves. Let's not pull any punches here. Owned slaves, and the fact that those slaves had to make the trip on that Trail of Tears also, and that they made it in captivity, and that and they were put to work in Oklahoma as well. So the question is, does the fact that Native people, as small a number as it may have been, does it complicate the fact that Native people were slaveholders? And and look, make no mistake about it, I am not going to justify anybody holding slaves, anybody holding human beings, because at the same time that anybody wants to make the argument about the somehow the hypocrisy and the the shame and the gall of it all that Native people held slaves, keep in mind that Native people were enslaved at the same period of time. The only reason that this circumstance even exists is one of the components of genocide, which is the assimilation component. I mean, the Cherokee had done what many other Native territories had attempted to do under duress, which was to assimilate and try to follow the standards that white people were establishing for education, for what farming would look like, abandoning many of our own practice and our own ideals. Our people picked up the Bible, they built churches, and they held slaves. They did, in some instances, they did everything that white men did. And really to even suggest, and again, I haven't seen the whole exhibit. I didn't go through the entire narrative that the Smithsonian was putting out, but to suggest that because a certain, and I don't even know what the right word is, class, segment of Native population went so far in the assimilation direction that they too purchased, owned, worked and in all likelihood abused in the same way that white people did slaves, it does not complicate the genocide story. It does not complicate the Trail of Tears story. If anything, consider the fact that even when Native people, and the same thing can be said for black people for that matter, even when we did exactly what the white people wanted us to do, which was to be like them, to work like them, to conduct commerce like them. Even when we did all those things, they still found a way to abuse our people. The Cherokee were forced out of their homelands, and even the factionalism that existed amongst the Cherokee nation, the Cherokee people. Both sides were being pulled in the directions of assimilation. Both, whether it was John Ross or I can't think of the other gentleman, Major, something or other they called him, the Major. The guys who actually sold out the Cherokees were Cherokees and sold out the land, didn't have the legal right to enter into any kind of agreement. But what would put the Cherokee and others on this Trail of Tears was treason. In fact, it was so much treason that the folks like John Ross, who was a slaveholder and who was very educated within the white man's standard of education, his family would actually assassinate every one of the Cherokee who were responsible for selling them out and forcing this Trail of Tears. So even within the factionalism, you had treachery, you had assimilation, you had genocide had gone beyond the idea of just killing our people. I mean, we were the victims of all kinds of racism and all kinds of other things. But even as our people assimilated, and I'm going to talk about that because, as many of you know, I lost a dear friend a couple of weeks ago now. And among my final exchanges with him on messaging, it was Sugar Montour mentioning that he wanted to write a book. And the book he wanted to write was Lies My Elders Told Me. Now, before everybody gets all bent out of shape, he didn't mean every elder lied to him. But what he meant was there are enough people that have come before us that have, let's put it this way, for all those who did much to preserve our identity and to hand down generation after generation elements of our culture, elements of our language, elements of our identity. There were just as many, if not more, who did not, and who did everything in their power to make us conform. And they did that through church. They did that through military service, basically assisting the United States in their imperial exploits, in their colonial exploits throughout the rest of the world. They did it through, I mean, we talk about the residential schools. Now, let's be clear. Not every child who got sent to who went to a residential school was ripped from their parents' hands. Some of the parents were complicit. Many of our communities had some complicity, including the one I'm sitting in here, right here in Cattaraugus. The Thomas Indian School was a local school, embraced. I mean, you don't hear a whole lot. I don't hear condemnation out of those people who were becoming devout Code of Handsome Lake followers. You don't hear a whole lot in the historical record about the newly formed Constitution of the Seneca Nation condemning the Thomas Indian School. You're going to hear plenty of people, if you talk to the people who actually went there, those last generations who went there, you're going to hear plenty of horror stories. There was complicity in assimilation. And this is when I refer to the cognitive dissonance of assimilation. What I'm talking about is the fact that many of us throughout many generations have made choices we knew were wrong. We knew were inconsistent with who we are, with what our identity is, what our sovereignty was. Many of us throughout the generations have made decisions and have lived lives that we knew were wrong. And we did so, and we justified them in various ways. We had an entire generation. I mean, and depending on which community you're from, the loss of our language, we can blame the governments and we can blame residential schools, but what about in our communities? My father's generation all spoke Mohawk. All of them. I remember hearing it growing up in the house. They all spoke. All my aunts and uncles, even around us children who had no idea what they were talking about. Why? Because they didn't teach us. None of my cousins were brought up with the language, but all of my uncles were. All of my aunts were. That was a conscious decision by a generation of Mohawk people. And why did they make that decision? For whatever reason, they were led to believe and they were convinced that having the language was a handicap and that it would not serve us going forward as we tried to carve out our lives in a white man's world. And you know what? They were wrong. They were wrong. This whole notion that that we had to conform, we had generations after generations adopt that idea. That's that cognitive dissonance. It's funny. You can go back generation after generation. You're always going to hear somebody in there say, never trust a white man. And yet, generation after generation, they were teaching us to try to be those. Try to be white men. So when the Smithsonian asked the question, whether some slaveholding Cherokees complicates the Trail of Tears narrative, well, I don't know if it complicates it. It certainly doesn't undermine that narrative. It doesn't undermine the narrative of genocide. I mean, we can say that it complicates it. It makes the story more intriguing. The fact that there would be Native people so assimilated by white Christian society that we would partake in the very sinful act that they did. We would partake in the sinful act of owning a human being, subjecting and submitting people to slavery, even at the same time our people were being submitted to slavery. New Jersey was one of the last northern states to still hold slaves. My friend Bob Henley wrote a whole story about a child. I mean, a series of stories about black children who were willed their freedom by their master, but no such thing was done for the Native children. Native people were shipped to the Caribbean to be slaves because we weren't effective slaves necessarily within, because of our skill set within our own environment. So when I get asked that question, and I have been asked that question, especially in my show in New York, I get asked that question about natives holding slaves. And it happened. Was it widespread? No. In fact, Native people played, in our communities, played a pretty big role in many aspects or many areas of what would be called the Underground Railroad or the ability for slaves to seek their freedom. And in fact, the relationship between black people and Native people, and it's what was laid out in the movie Rumble, The Indians Who Rocked the World, the fact that we had a blending of cultures that not only affected music, but affected, our culture in so many different ways. And that's why if you look at, black people who did come from that slave era, whose ancestry does come from that slave era, you'll find many of those people have Native ancestry in their bloodlines as well. Not just the famous people like Jimi Hendrix. But when I saw this article and somebody asked me would I address this on a show, and I'm thinking, yeah, sure, I'll address it. And I'm not going to make any apologies for Native people holding slaves. But it is part of that genocide. It's a part of that whole idea of getting inside a people and turning them into something they weren't. That's what assimilation is. And assimilation is genocide. I mean, the genocide, has a series of definitions. I don't have them sitting here in front of me. I guess I should have pulled it up before the show. But genocide is any number of activities that a dominant culture does to another people to end their existence, to eliminate them as a people. And, and when I hear people say, well, and I've heard people say things like cultural genocide. No, I'm not going to put a precursor on the front of a word like genocide. You can't just put a word like cultural in front of it. And what's that say? That it wasn't really genocide? It was only genocide. It was only the killing of our culture? No. If you kill a culture, you kill a people. Because if you wipe out a culture of a people, then what are those people left with? What are they then? They are somebody else. Especially if you're going to, not only denationalize somebody, but then you're going to impose your nation, your culture, your jurisdiction. You're going to impose every aspect: religion, military service, conscription, the draft. The capitalist system, the means for people to earn a living and support them. You're going to impose everything upon another people. That's genocide. I mean, people can think about genocide, and all I can think about is execution of people. Yeah, that's genocide too. And ripping kids out of their homes, or coercing parents to give up their kids, creating a condition for which parents can't even raise their children, and so you alleviate that burden by taking those children away, cutting their hair, stripping their language, indoctrinating them with the religion. That's genocide. And, I heard somebody else ask me about paper genocide. And I flat out said, look, I have an issue. I have an issue with taking a word like genocide and then putting a precursor in front of it. I don't know what paper genocide means. Is it genocide or is it not genocide? I mean, there are many different strategies of genocide. The blood quantum issue, trying to make us go away by saying that our bloodline has been thinned. I mean, Pierre Trudeau once said, well, if you can't speak your language anymore, if you don't possess enough of your culture, then you can no longer can call yourself an Indigenous person. Well, who the hell is he to make that determination? And of course, who's the Prime Minister of Canada now? His son. So when I look at the policies of the United States and Canada, and frankly, the Brits in every one of their colonial settlements, there are any number of ways that genocide has been perpetrated against people. Death and destruction is not the least of those. I mean, it is certainly one of the, yes, I mean, the actual murdering of people, yeah, that's genocide. The killing of women and children, unarmed women and children, yeah, that's genocide. But so is adopting a policy that is, for one thing, imposes a level of racism that most people have never seen. If you look throughout American history and you read how everybody from Thomas Jefferson and George Washington to every, most authors, the American authors, I mean, newspaper editors, all these people, how they characterize Native people. And even as they looked and they promoted the whole noble savage, identity, they always did that as if that was something in the past, like L. Frank Baum. Oh, yeah, let them live in our memories as the grand kings of the forest and the plain. But why not exterminate them for what they are now? Let them live in our memories, but what they are now is not worth saving. And in fact, we've wronged them so many times, and they've become such a miserable, wretched pack of whining cur that merely licks the hand that smites them. We'd be better off just exterminating them. I mean, that's what the wonderful Wizard of Oz guy suggested. And that wasn't a narrowly held view. When he wrote those genocide editorials, he wasn't condemned for them. In fact, a couple of days after he called for the extermination of Native people was the massacre at Wounded Knee. Did he cause it? I don't know if I'd go quite that far. But he certainly created the social atmosphere that was willing to accept such a thing. Genocide is not just herding Jews to a gas chamber or shooting Native people like fish in a barrel. It is doing everything within your power to change or eliminate the people as a distinct people. Today, the United States insists that we are subordinate to them. Their so-called federal recognition, by definition, it says a tribe, band, or nation of Indians subordinate to the laws of the United States. That's why when somebody says, "Are you federally recognized?" I say, "Hell no." I'm as a Mohawk or as a Gunyagahaga, yeah, we've been recognized in treaty, but as a recognized tribe by the federal government, no, nope, don't want it, don't need it. And many of the organizations, tribal organizations, nations, if you will, peoples that are federally recognized, they didn't ask for that distinction. I would dare say the Seneca Nation never applied for federal recognition as a tribe, band, or nation of Indians subordinate to the laws of the United States. Hell no. It's a definition that the United States changed all on their own. There's no question that the United States has recognized the sovereignty of Native people. In spite of the doctrine of Christian discovery, in spite of codifying this racist doctrine into U.S. law through its Supreme Court decisions, Johnson v. McIntosh and the rest, it still stands in stark contradiction to the language that they crafted in the treaties that they tried to induce us to sign, including Canandaigua, where they say on three separate occasions in that treaty that they drafted, that they wrote, that the United States recognize that our land is ours, and they will never claim the same until we decide to sell it to them. And nor will we ever be disturbed in our free use and enjoyment of our land. That our land is not a part of the state. It's not a part of the federal government. They made those distinct characterizations in their own language. But today, every November when everybody marches off to Canandaigua so they can all feel good and put on their regalia and meet up with a bunch of white men to claim how secure and sacred that treaty is, ask one of those white men, do you still recognize that our land is not yours? See what they say. Of course they don't. Now, that doesn't mean that it is theirs. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they're the president, if they're a congressman, a senator, or, state legislator. It doesn't matter who they are. They don't get to decide that. But when I look at these, again, even as these pieces of history get exposed, and look, by all means, tell the story. Tell the story of slaveholding by Native people. Because you know why? It is such a devastating example of what assimilation does to a human being. The fact that assimilation would turn our people into a man who thinks they can own another man. Even while many Native peoples were standing side by side with black with their oppressed brothers and from the black and the slave community, we had the arrogance amongst our own people, and it exists today. It exists today. You can go to any Native territory. You can listen to these Jefferson Keel and Brian Clattersby and all these people who are part of NCAI. And you can listen to the folks from USET, and you can listen to the folks from the Assembly of First Nations. You can listen to all of these people brag it up about what a great organization they are as they completely suck up to the United States and Canada. There are billions of dollars spent every year by Native territories who have much bigger things and much better things they could spend money on, but they're spending billions of dollars on white lawyers and lobbyists and consultants trying to get legislative fixes to what the United States has done to us. Never once considering that their power, that the power that they tried to assert over us with the legislatures is the problem. Not that you can convince them to create new acts of Congress that are going to fix it. They are the problem. They aren't the solution. But that is how assimilated. And that's the same slaveholding mentality. When you look at how many American flags fly at native administration buildings, including here at the Seneca Nation, Standing Rock Sioux had 8 of them, it looked like, in front of their headquarters. Dave Archambault and his sister, who worked for the President Obama at the very time that they were proposing this pipeline to go through their territory and cut across their water supply, was just fully embracing nothing but love for the very president who was pushing that project through, to endanger his people. Yeah, it's easy to blame Trump for this stuff now, yeah, and he's a jerk. But the Dakota Access Pipeline, that was an Obama-era project. And that was embraced by Democrats. Hillary Clinton refers to those as federal infrastructure projects. Heidi Heitkamp, all in for the Dakota Access Pipeline, Keystone XL Pipeline, all of these things. And of course the Republicans are. Drill, baby, drill, right? Our people, many of the folks who are propped up as leaders, are so much of that same mentality. Of course there was going to be native slaveholders. They were the early ones. They were the early ones to suck up to the white men and their way of life. All right, we're at the bottom of the hour. I'm going to take a break, try to catch a little bit of my voice back. I'm going to, you talk about assimilation, you talk about oppression, you talk about being subjugated. There's no better example of that than being locked up in prison.
Razor wire cut you to the bone, son. It can make meanest long for home, and it's a crying shame. Just yourself to blame. And every morning when the sun comes up, you stand in your cage like a little pup. You wait for the man to turn the key. You step outside to greet. I raise a white. It's a crying shame. Late at night when all the killers are down, hear the teardrops splashing on that concrete ground. It's a dangerous game. They cry for their own pain. A razor wide of pain. Watch it gleam on that sunny day, tempting you to try beyond your way. You try to swagger like you don't care, but you're always under that wire's glare. A razor wire, it's a scary game. A razor wire's game.
All right, right, that's Razor Wire by John McLeod. I gotta admit, I stood behind some of that Razor Wire. I know the feeling. I know what it's like to have been behind that razor wire and staring at it every day. Looking forward to the day that you return to your family. And I didn't stand behind that razor wire because I committed a crime. I did it because I fought back. I fought back to the very things that we talk about here on the show. And I'm not going to, I don't wear that on my shirt sleeve, but when my friend John McLeod was facing a similar situation, I talked to him about it. And as somebody who went through it, I tried to prepare for it the best I could. And he wrote that song and he sent it to me right away because he wanted me to hear it. He wanted me to know that I helped him. Yeah, just a little background story on Razor Wire by John McLeod. Hey, look, I want to acknowledge and give thanks to my sponsors. I want to give thanks to Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, and my good friends like Ed Schindler and Cynthia Trice and Neville Spring, and many others who have helped in the past. And of course, I still need to, put my friend Sugar Montour in that category because he is one of the guys who helped me do this show from day one. And I'm finishing up our 8th year now, and look forward to our 9th year as we go through the summer. And Sugar Montour was one of the guys who helped me do that. I'm going to be working to try to come up with some other folks to support what I do because I had many people back when I was on commercial radio and I had to have advertisers. There were a lot more people who were willing to throw an ad up or make a contribution here or there. But I don't. In fact, when I played that show the other day that had Murray Porter and Sugar Montour on it, you could hear all the ads that I was running back then when I was on commercial radio. I'm afraid I'm going to have to go to the well with some of these guys and see who I can have fill in to cover for not only losing my friend, but losing one of my strongest sponsors. So, but I do want to thank all those who did help back then because we would have never gotten here today. So all of you who've taken out ads and made donations and been sponsors and donors to the show, I thank you all for doing your part and allowing me and helping me, enabling me to educate, entertain, and inform for all these years. I want to thank all of you for doing your part and for joining in the fight. I also want to thank Unity Stream and Apache Radio Net for providing our streaming. I want to thank CKWE again for both the simulcast and the rebroadcast, as well as Netroots Radio, Real People's Media, and Indigenous Resistance Radio for carrying Let's Talk Native on their networks. But I also want to thank all of you who share the show. I know I don't have 10,000 people listening to us while we're streaming live. I may have a half a dozen or a dozen maybe. But as the show sits on Facebook, more and more people are catching at least pieces of it. It's a 1-hour show, so it's not a terribly long program to catch. And we average 1,000 or 1,500 views per show that we put up. And part of that is because of folks like my wife who shared the program on other Facebook group pages. But I know many of you share the show on Facebook. You share the SoundCloud audio that I post. You share the YouTube videos that I post, and I appreciate all of that because some of these conversations need to be had. Because, and again, on this subject, I guess the natural thing that I guess people would expect is that we would somehow try to gloss over so many of the aspects of that assimilation. Because, what happens is I think the argument is, well, does the fact that you have been so willing or so that you have been so assimilated, does it somehow soften the edge? Does it somehow make the genocide less of a tragedy? And I say hell no. It doesn't. But I know that people don't want to own our role in our own genocide. And how some of the things that we've been complicit in, the idea and I'll tell you, my buddy just posted a quote and said, my elders didn't lie to me. They just didn't know. No, some of them knew. And we know. Look, we're lying to ourselves every single day if we think we're doing the best we can. Are we doing the best we can? Are we taking the easiest route we can? Are we giving to our children what we really need to give to them? Or are we letting somebody else raise them? Look, and I'm guilty of that too. I know it. And admitting it doesn't absolve me from that either. We need to do better. But you know what? Our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, we can go back 7 or 8 generations. And we can literally see the decisions that were made that we're still living with some of the adverse effects of those decisions. Look, I understand we are in their shoes. And so when people say, yeah, well, some people had to face, living a certain way or dying. And, I can sit here in a really comfortable chair in my studio and condemn people who had to make those tough decisions. But it doesn't change the fact that we've had generations that have done things that have caused adverse effects to our. Look, when people talk about the land or the language having gone away, we lost 99% of our land, while our people were still very in control of the language. They had the language, they had the culture, and you know what? Part of the reason our longhouses are in the mess they're in right now is, again, because we failed. I mean, I don't mean just our generation, but generations before have failed. When the Seneca Nation adopted a constitution, they did so because they bailed on what they were calling the chief system for a new constitution. The fact that they even called it a chief system shows you how badly the system had degraded. It wasn't a chief system. It was supposed to be a clan system. If it was a chief system, then I'm all for throwing it out, because that's not what we were supposed to have. That's not what the Guyana or the Goa said. It wasn't a chief system. It was a clan system. I've said this before. When the Seneca Nation adopted their constitution in 1848 or whatever the year was, women couldn't vote. We talk today in terms of how much we embraced and empowered our women through our culture, how equal our women were to us historically, how endeared our women were as a part of Iroquois and Haudenosaunee culture. Well, it couldn't have been too endeared if nobody noticed that the women were left out of the right to vote when the Seneca Nation adopted a constitution. Things had degraded so badly. Women had become victims of male dominance by native people, by our own people. So I'm sorry. Somebody's going to say, my elders didn't lie to me. Yes, they did. Some of them did. Some of them aren't telling the truth. You know what? As I see here today is the 73rd anniversary of something special. You know what's the anniversary of? The 73rd anniversary of? It's the 73rd anniversary of the largest bombing campaign the world had ever seen. It was the bombing campaign of Japan. No, I'm not talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. No, that didn't happen in March. That happened in August. In March of 1945, America and their allies torched Tokyo and 4 other major cities in Japan. Civilian populations. And we're going to tell the story about how all those brave men saved the United States in World War II. The United States wasn't in that much jeopardy in World War II. Yeah, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. You know what they bombed? Boats. Yeah, there are human beings there too, and I don't want to diminish the loss of life from the bombing of Pearl Harbor. But Honolulu didn't get bombed. The civilian population didn't get bombed. The military got bombed. And why? Because the U.S. was building up more and more military presence in the South Pacific. Yeah, Pearl Harbor, but also let's not forget the Philippines. Let's not forget how close to Japan's back door the United States was becoming a military power. So the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and who's the United States bomb? Every major city in that small island nation. And after they bombed the hell out of it on March 10th and 11th and 12th of 1945, crippling Japan, putting it basically on its knees in the run-up to what would have been a surrender anyway, they dropped 2 atomic bombs in August of that same year. A country reeling from what was, this largest aerial assault ever took place. And, I bring that up in this context because I saw this, a friend of mine, my friend Cindy, sent me this this email, this link, talking about, again, that aerial campaign. And again, heroizing it, bragging it up, what a great thing it was to bomb the civilian population of Japan. And the last photo in that series, it's got native code talkers in there. Navajo code talkers. Because we can't talk about World War II without promoting the heroes that Native people represented in World War II. Well, let's think about that some more. Our languages were intentionally destroyed. We had generations of our people who said, no, I'm not going to teach my kids that language. Not going to do it. I don't want to put my kids to it. And then, in the midst of this, the U.S. military turns our languages into a weapon of war, into a military asset. And let me be clear. It wasn't just the language that was the asset. It was the speakers who were the asset. In fact, our enlisted men who were code talkers, they didn't have the same standing as other enlisted men. In fact, a code talker usually had a person or a series of people whose job it was to make sure that code talker was never captured alive. Again, you heard me right, captured alive. So that meant that rather than allowing a native code talker to be captured alive, there were people instructed to kill them. Americans were instructed to kill code talkers before they could be captured alive. Why? Because they didn't want that code broken. Those human beings who spoke the code weren't that significant. The fact that the military the United States had militarized our language meant that that language was their asset, and that asset would be protected to such a length that a Navajo could not be captured. They would have to be executed by their own personnel, their own brethren. So when I know that there are veterans who are proud of their service. And you know what? I don't diminish the bravery, even for those code talkers. And, even though many of them were forced into these positions, there were many Native people who were arrested and told, you're either going to go in the military or you're going to prison. So I don't begrudge those people who did that. But the idea that our language and the destruction of our language, which is part of that genocide, and again, part of that genocide that our own people were complicit in. So not only do we have our own people who are complicit in not extending our language to the next generation. We had a certain segment of those people who were complicit in allowing the military to militarize our language for their purposes. You know, and if you want me to sing the praises of Navajo code talkers, I would rather heroize them for how they taught the language after their military service. How many people they shared that language with. Not how much military they shared it with. Not how they helped the United States beat the evil empire of Japan, this tiny little island country that in no way, shape, or form was ever any real threat to the United States. The United States was not going to be conquered by Japan. And it wasn't going to be conquered by Mussolini or Hitler or anybody else. It wasn't going to happen. Now, I'm not suggesting fighting back against, Japan, Italy, and Germany wasn't. I'm not saying that wasn't the right thing to do, fighting back against. I'm not suggesting that. And I'm not suggesting that there shouldn't have been, an appropriate retaliation for the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Which, by the way, in case you forget, Pearl Harbor, it was Hawaii. Now, Hawaii wasn't a state in 1945. It was and remains an illegally occupied territory, a sovereign nation that the United States violated. So while Japan may have dropped bombs on Pearl Harbor, it's really easy for everybody else to forget what the United States did to Pearl Harbor in the theft of it, in the theft of the Hawaiian Kingdom. But while Japan would bomb Pearl Harbor, when you consider what the United States did, and of course now we stand in all these conversations about nuclear power and nuclear weapons and, who is the arbiter of justice when it comes to nuclear arms? The only country on the planet that killed a civilian population, I remind you, with 2 nuclear weapons, with 2 atomic bombs. So that is what the United States is. I know that's not the way they're going to teach it to our children, as our children attend public schools. So I guess to get back to the original story, does the fact that Native people, certain segments of Native society, that they participated in the slave trade, slave holding, slave owning, slave buying and selling, and you have to assume every abuse that a slave felt at the hands of a white man, they felt at the hands of their native masters as well. Does the fact that exists, does that absolve the United States for any of their genocide and their atrocities? Hell no, it doesn't. The fact that that exists is because of the United States and the atrocities that they committed. And yeah, we've had generations of complicity that have adopted the very things that we absolutely can stand here in open condemnation of, including slavery, including some of the abuses that happened, some of those abuses that were promoted by church, some of those abuses that were promoted by military, some of those abuses that were promoted by the oil barons of the United States, by those who would gut our land with mining and highways and dumps, those that would contaminate our politics, eradicate traditional governing systems, contaminate them, turn them into something that just barely resemble anything that sustained us for thousands of years. Impoverished our people, changed the ways of life of our people to the point that we were no longer sustainable. Our people live in abject poverty in most of our territories. And it's not because our people were lazy. That's again part of the myth. You go into many native territories, and you can absolutely see the distinction between the haves and the have-nots along the lines of who works for tribal government and who doesn't. Yeah, in some territories, you've had some private sector development, tobacco and, smoke shop owners. We've heard lots of horror stories about the evil businessmen. Frankly, that's been some of the only balance to the fact that you've had career politicians in native territories. That's how you end up with the goon squads in Oglala. That's how you end up with guys like Peter McDonald, Navajo code talker, who ends up having to go to prison because he embezzled from his own nation, his own people. That's how you end up with the Sherman Alexie, propped up by white people. Oh, this great Native American author turns out to be that he was a sexual abuser. And I can list a whole bunch of other people too. Some a lot closer here. Oren Lyons, he was one of the worst womanizers that ever walked the face of the earth. But everybody's going to laud him. They're going to put him up. They're going to prop him up. White people especially. We have people in our midst that have misrepresented the history. They have changed, the face of history so much that it becomes difficult. It becomes difficult to educate each other. I just saw another story that was put up on Facebook that talked about the role that the Iroquois played in the women's suffrage movement. The fact that women getting the right to vote and that kind of stuff. And ironically, the picture they used in that article has a native person standing up in front of a big crowd. That native person was Red Jacket. That picture is the same picture that gets used, mischaracterized, and used in so many inappropriate places. Because that picture, that painting, is the trial of Red Jacket. What was Red Jacket on trial for? Well, because Handsome Lake and Corn Planter were trying him for witchcraft. They wanted to kill him. They wanted to try him for witchcraft. Now you consider that witchcraft was again one of those things that women, going back to the Salem days, but certainly within native territories, were oftentimes almost completely defenseless once they were accused of such a thing. Witchcraft, charging somebody with witchcraft was a classic example of misogyny. And yet that photograph gets used, inappropriately so all the time. So I bring it up because we need to tell some of the true history. And we need to own our own responsibilities in some of the things that went badly, including slaveholding, including sending our own kids to these residential schools, including the selling out of our lands. Look, there's a reason that among the supplies that were requisitioned for treaty making were wagon loads of rum. There was a reason for that. And it's not just because of our weakness for alcohol. It wasn't just a weakness. It was a love for it. We stand here today with every bit the alcohol and substance abuse problems that have plagued our people since the first white man introduced it to us. We have been completely ineffective at drawing a line in the sand on that. Even guys, again, look to some of the speeches that guys like Red Jacket gave. Red Jacket spoke openly about how strong he wanted to stand up to alcohol but then ultimately admits that he submitted to it. That somehow it was like this indomitable force that he could not oppose, that he had to succumb to it. I mean, how is it that we live today in a world where we don't recognize the very things that are killing our people? Looking at some of our territories, you got tribal government that are hand in hand with imposing state law on our territories. State law, not even federal law, state law. They have tribal police. They don't enforce quote-unquote tribal law. Hell no. They're imposing state law on their own people on their own sovereign territories. And I say sovereign territories because just because a tribal government with its tribal police force and its tribal court systems are adopting or are trying to impose state law on our territories, submitting to U.S. 232 and 233 or whatever, doesn't mean that it's right. And doesn't mean that it's really lawful. I mean, it might be lawful for the state. It may be lawful as far as the federal government is concerned, but so is slavery. So is paying bounties on redskins. It's gotten to the point where words like sovereignty, once they stick the word tribal in front of it, almost means nothing. Another word that has become popular is this notion of decolonization. Well, I'm afraid decolonization is going to go the same way as words like sovereignty, where they become meaningless. I look at things like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, knowing, and in its own article says this is the minimum standard. And it is a minimum standard, one that I'm not prepared to live by. That's not the standard that I'm basing my life on. They use the word sovereignty in that whole declaration once, and it's not talking about our sovereignty. And they have to put the caveats up there. Nothing in this thing is suggesting statehood for indigenous people. We don't want to recognize them as nations. We'll play around with language associated with self-determination and self-regulation. Look, I'm glad the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was done and that it was approved, that the international community accepts a standard, a minimum standard. And of course it would have to be a minimum standard. But that's not the standard that I'm willing to embrace. The United States doesn't even meet the minimum standard, nor does Canada. Nor do most nations that have an indigenous population. But what do we do about it? Very, very little. We're not even willing to hold the United States or Canada to the minimum standard that the rest of the international community has adopted. We're not willing to do it. Why? Because we think we've carved out something within the system that works for us. All right, well, folks, that just about wraps it up. Let me go out with a little bit of Logan stats, and we'll be back here on Friday. Catch me in New York on WBAI Thursday morning from 10 till noon. Look forward to it. Yahweh.
It's a simple song, simple man. It's a simple thrift store clothes and a simple thing. He's gonna make it someday. He's gonna make it someday. That was a lifetime ago. A lifetime ago. Lifetime ago. A lifetime ago. A lifetime ago. Lifetime ago. Ain't no thief gonna take my gold. Ain't no priest gonna save my soul. Ain't no thief gonna take my gold. Ain't no priest gonna save my soul. My soul.